Good morning. In keeping with the theme for this lesson, I almost want to start out and say, can everyone hear me okay? Yeah. This lesson is called Whisperers. And as I was putting this together, I remembered a story that I've heard my dad tell about his father. So my grandfather, whom I never met, passed away before I was born. In his older years, his hearing wasn't so good. And I guess they had gone to the doctor one time, sitting in the waiting room full of people, and I don't know who he was talking to. Maybe it was my dad, maybe it was my grandmother. But he says, I have to go to the bathroom. And it was probably about that loud. So of course, at that volume, and I think all of y'all heard that, even though I whispered. It kind of defeats the purpose of whispering. And so everybody in the waiting room apparently laughed. But for him, he had to whisper at that volume in order to hear himself whisper. Another way that I've observed whispering to be effective is in the event you have ever enjoyed professional wrestling like myself, half of the entertainment with that is the ability for the people to talk. And that's allegedly what sells tickets, what gets people to buy a ticket and show up to the show. And it seemed as if a lot of entertainers, a lot of wrestlers, when they're talking, when they're cutting their promos, many of them will do it where they're yelling. And what stands out is when you have someone who doesn't yell. Or perhaps they vary their voice to where you're intense for a minute and then you dial it down to emphasize your point, which makes everybody be quiet to listen to see what is this fella saying. Perhaps it's even in a whisper. And those are two very different examples of whispering, but what they both illustrate is whispering is meant to limit the audience and or emphasize the message. Usually, if we're sitting next to someone, we don't want everyone else to hear what we're saying, we'll lean over and whisper it to them. Which makes the person you're whispering in their ear, they've got to listen a little harder, if you're not talking like my grandfather, to hear what it is you're saying. So keep that concept in mind as we look at our opening passage here, Romans chapter 1, starting with verse 28. Paul writes, and even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a debased mind, to do those things which are not fitting, being filled with all unrighteousness, sexual immorality, wickedness, covetousness, maliciousness, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, evil-mindedness. They are whisperers, backbiters, haters of God, violent, proud, boasters, inventors of evil things, disobedient to parents, undiscerning, untrustworthy, unloving, unforgiving, unmerciful, who, knowing the righteous judgment of God, that those who practice such things are deserving of death, not only do the same, but also approve of those who practice them. If you really dissect that passage, can you think of a worse group to be hanging out with than what was just described there? It's so bad. How does Paul describe this? Verse 28. That God gave them over to a debased mind. And that phrase, that God gave them up, gave them over, is, I think it's the third time in this chapter that is used. They're so bad that God's had to write these people off. There's no hope for you. Because Those are the things that they're involved in. And in the midst of that description, it's a description of Gentile sinners who clearly need Jesus. They need a lot of things. They need Jesus. They need some faith. They need to repent. They need to make some changes to their lives. But it's so bad that God has given them over to their debased mind. Their mind that's so corrupted by sin and all these other specific types of sins. It's filled with all unrighteousness. That's what it says in verse 29. Being filled with all unrighteousness. And whether or not filled with all unrighteousness is one of these terms, or that's the blanket statement and then he defines it by the rest of the list, it's a pretty extensive list. It still may not be exhaustive, but you don't want to be on this list. And in the midst of that list, at the end of verse 29, they are whisperers. Now, normally, when you think of a whisperer, someone who's a gossip, you don't think of that as being, or at least in our society today, we don't think of that as being something absolutely horrible, do we? Everybody does it, right? When I was a kid, growing up, I saw quite a bit of Hee Haw because that was one of my dad's favorite shows. And if you watched that show, there was one recurring spot on the show where they would have, I think it was some women singing, and they were talking, like sitting around doing the laundry at the creek or something, if I remember right. And what was the jingle they were singing? I'm not one to go around repeating gossip. I forget the rest, yada, yada, yada. So you better listen up close the first time, right? Because I'm not going to repeat it, I'm just going to say it once. We talk about it in terms of it's not that bad, everybody does it, wink, wink, it's okay. But it's right here on the list that Paul has in Romans chapter 1 with some pretty serious stuff that we don't joke about. First, right there at the end of verse 29, they are whisperers. That starts a list of nouns, of descriptive terms for people. They are whisperers, backbiters, haters of God. We don't want to be lumped in with haters of God, do we? Violent, proud, boasters, inventors of evil things. So, wow, maybe whisperers, it's a little more serious than perhaps we realize. So what we're going to do with this lesson, we're going to look at who are whisperers and what are they associated with and what do they do, and have the Bible answer these questions for us. And you know, it's something that's good for us to constantly be reminded of, because I think it's very easy to someone tell us something, or we overhear something and we repeat it to somebody else, not just to say, hey, so-and-so said this, but there's a certain connotation with it, right? Man, you got to hear what I just heard, because read something into this, right? It's easy to do. It's all in our society, and when it does hit the church, bad things happen. Who are whisperers? Let's turn over to 1 Timothy chapter 5. 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 13. Here Paul writes, "And besides they learn to be idle, wandering about from house to house, and not only idle, but also gossips and busybodies, saying things which they ought not. Therefore I desire that the younger widows marry, bear children, manage the house, give no opportunity to the adversary to speak reproachfully." Paul says that these whisperers, we're lumping this in with gossips and busybodies. It's someone who goes around talking privately, secretly, gossiping, tattling. Talebearer is another word, slanderer. We're talking about other people, and it may all be true, but regardless of the truth of the statement, what's the purpose behind it being shared? Is it to build up someone, or is it to tear someone down? Is it to make fun of the person? Is it to make ourselves look better because we're better than that person? In the context here, in 1 Timothy chapter 5, when Paul writes this, it's in the context of, it's a negative connotation. They learn to be idle. He's talking about young widows. Their husbands passed away, and I guess they're home alone. They have nothing to do. And it causes them to be idle. And what's the old cliche that I don't think is actually in the Bible, but I guess this passage probably bears it out. Idle hands are the devil's workshop. Okay? If we're not doing something to stay busy, then we become a busybody where we're not doing anything that's helpful. And in fact, what we're doing is tearing others down. It says wandering about from house to house. Not only idle, but gossips and busybodies, saying things which they ought not. And because of that, in order to give them something to do, Paul's encouraging them to go out and remarry, bear children, do something productive with your lives. Find opportunities to serve others. We talked about labors of love in our Bible class this morning. A variety of things we can do. If we're looking for opportunities, there's plenty of things that we can be busy doing that are helpful. Being a whisperer, though, is not one of them. So go back to the passage we read in Romans chapter 1. Who are the whisperers associated with in this passage? Again, it's not the best of the best. It's not the cream of the crop. These are the worst people that we can think of. Haters of God, murderers, sexually immoral, malicious. They're full of envy, murder, strife, deceit. On it goes. These are not people we want to be around or be associated with. Undiscerning, untrustworthy, unloving, unforgiving, unmerciful. And then the kicker is at the end. The last phrase in Romans 1:32. Those who practice such things are deserving of death. Not only do the same, but also approve of those who practice them. It's not enough to say, oh, I'm not partaking in all that. I'm just standing back and watching them and I'm listening. We're still encouraging it, even if silently. We're still taking part in it if that's the case. And that's lumped in here as on the same level. So what exactly do whisperers do? The Bible has a lot to say that perhaps we've never really considered or put it all together, or we've forgotten over the years. There's a few interesting statements in Proverbs. Turn to Proverbs chapter 11, verse 13. What do whisperers do? Proverbs 11, verse 13. A talebearer reveals secrets, but he who is of a faithful spirit conceals a matter. Do we reveal secrets? Sometimes someone may come to us and tell us something in confidence. And what happens if we then break that confidence, shatter that, betray that confidence, and go and spread somebody's dirty laundry all over the place? Does that help the person that came and confided in us? Not at all. If it's something in the family, or if it's something in the church, what kind of what's the result there? I've seen that split churches before. You may have seen similar things. What else? Turn over to Proverbs chapter 16. Proverbs 16, verse 28. A perverse man sows strife, and a whisperer separates the best of friends. Separates best friends. Why? Because someone came in and said, hey, your buddy over here, you know what he did? Even if it's true, it may or may not be true, but what happens? We listen to that, and if there was really a problem, what should have happened? Somebody go directly to that person and settle it. Whispering about it and spreading rumors all over the place, all that's going to do is separate people and cause divisions. Also, jump over to the next chapter, Proverbs 17 and verse 9. He who covers a transgression seeks love, but he who repeats a matter separates friends. They can be long-lasting friendships that are destroyed because someone gossiped or whispered or slandered and so on. One more from Proverbs. Oh, actually, I lied. Two more. Proverbs chapter 26. Proverbs 26, verse 20. Where there is no wood, the fire goes out. And where there is no talebearer, strife ceases. Wherever you've got a talebearer or a whisperer, there's going to be strife. Someone who's, another phrase we might see, is sowing discord among the brethren. Right? Because no good is coming from it. It just causes strife. And then the last one from Proverbs is Proverbs chapter 22 and verse 1. A good name is to be chosen rather than great riches, loving favor rather than silver and gold. What's the net result of whispering? It destroys people's reputations. And that can be the victim of the gossip. It can also be the person who's spreading it. Maybe we heard something and we shared it and it wasn't even true. And now we're partially responsible for the fallout of that. Maybe people don't trust us anymore to confide in us, or anything we may say. We've got to take it with a grain of salt because we don't know how believable it is. It can destroy people's reputations. Back in the New Testament, there's some other things we can see. We're supposed to, as Christians, we're supposed to love one another. We're supposed to show brotherly love. We're supposed to love our neighbor as ourselves, esteem others more highly than ourselves. None of that is served by whispering. Look at Luke chapter 6, starting with verse 31. And just as you want men to do to you, you also do likewise. But if you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners love those who love them. And if you do good to those who do good to you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners do the same. And if you lend to those from whom you hope to receive back, what credit is that to you? For even sinners lend to sinners to receive as much back. But love your enemies, do good and lend, hoping for nothing in return, and your reward will be great. And you will be sons of the Most High, for he is kind to the unthankful and evil. Jesus encourages us to love our enemies, to love everyone, but especially do good to those who do ill towards us. Whispering and gossiping and things like that don't serve that purpose. Another passage on this note is Romans chapter 13, and verse 10. Love does no harm to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfillment of the law. We're just flat out not showing love if we're talking about others behind their back in this type of context. What are we to do with love? Paul encourages us to bear one another's burdens. Galatians chapter 6 and verse 1. Brethren, if a man is overtaken in any trespass, you who are spiritual, restore such a one in a spirit of gentleness, considering yourself, lest you also be tempted. Bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. If we hear that someone is in sin. Especially a brother or sister in Christ. Someone is in sin. Paul's encouraging us here, you who are spiritual, restore such one. Go to that person and try to work with them. Try to point that out. That they may not realize the sin. That's the pattern. Paul doesn't say, brethren, if a man is overtaken in any trespass, go talk about it to half the church. Right? And that's, again, that's where the strife and division and everything else can result. Paul also describes it as being disorderly. Turn to 2 Thessalonians chapter 3. 2 Thessalonians 3, verse 11. For we hear that there are some who walk among you in a disorderly manner, not working at all, but are busybodies. Now those who are such, we command and exhort through our Lord Jesus Christ that they work in quietness and eat their own bread. Again, similar to what we read in 1 Timothy chapter 5. When we don't have enough to do, we're more likely to get in trouble. Here Paul's talking about there are some walking in a disorderly manner. They're not working at all, but they become busybodies. If someone is a whisperer, and they do this regularly for a long enough time, what perception do people have of that person? Do you see that they isolate themselves? They wind up with very few friends? And why is that? Because people can't trust them. You don't know what they're going to say to you. You don't know what they're going to say about you to someone else. We used to live in a neighborhood where there was an individual there who would go around, and on one level, I think she was trying to be friendly and meet the neighbors and talk to them. But man, anytime she talked to you, you would hear something about somebody else. And at some point, it made you wonder, well, if I'm hearing this about this neighbor and this neighbor and this neighbor, and then 2 days later, I see her talking to one of them, well, what's she saying about me? Right? My observation was she may have been, just like what we read there in 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, idle. She was retired. Not that there's anything wrong with being retired, but she just didn't have enough to do and was going out, and in the guise of being friendly and being social, we're just talking about other people. And it's not helping, wasn't helping the neighborhood. It certainly wasn't helping her reputation in the neighborhood. And then the bad thing is, when we talk to our other neighbors, what do? We're talking about what we heard from her. Oh yeah, she told me this, or she told you this, and so on. And whispering breeds more whispering. Which leads into the next point. What does it do? The whisperer becomes then the one that everyone else talks about. Turn to back to Galatians chapter 6. Galatians chapter 6, verse 7. Do not be deceived. God is not mocked. For whatever a man sows, that he will also reap. For he who sows to the flesh will of the flesh reap corruption, but he who sows to the Spirit will of the Spirit reap everlasting life. If we're constantly sowing whispering and gossip, what's that going to reap? More whispering and gossip, and it's going to come back on us. In essence, it's just a variety of ways of speaking evil of others, whether it's deserved or not. In Bible class this morning, as we were talking about labors of love, we talked a little bit about the idea that some people are a little harder to love than others. I think that's a true statement. And but you know what? I have seen in some Christians, you know that they're a little frustrated with somebody, but they will still look for a way to say something nice about the person. Have you seen that? It's so easy to perhaps rag on somebody for whatever. But it's so refreshing when we see someone that says, you know, I really like how they do this and this. And it's a way to be complimentary. It's a way to not speak evil of others. The last passage that we'll look at comes from 1 Peter. 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 15. This is in the last point of what do whisperers do? Whisperers suffer. It's a point that Peter makes here, but let's end on the contrast that he makes. 1 Peter 4, verse 15. But let none of you suffer as a murderer, a thief, an evildoer, or as a busybody in other people's matters. Do murderers suffer? Yeah, even if they don't get caught. I mean, getting caught and facing the penalty for their crime is probably enough suffering as it is. Even if they're not caught, though, if they've got any sort of conscience whatsoever, they're suffering in their own mind with the guilt of what they've done, right? In the last couple weeks, when was it Kyle Rittenhouse, when his trial was on television, you know, the jury found that he was not guilty of murder, that his acts were in self-defense. But did it look like he suffered as a result of everything that had happened? Say what you will about how genuine his emotion and crying and so on was. But I think anyone that goes through what he went through, he's going to be dealing with that for the rest of his life. Even if it was in self-defense, he ended the lives of what, 2 people, injured another. That's heavy stuff. Peter here says, let none of you suffer for these types of sins. Don't suffer because you murdered someone. Don't suffer because you're a thief. Don't suffer because you're an evildoer or a busybody. Don't suffer as a busybody. Busybodies suffer, yeah, from the things that we talked about. They ruin their own reputation. They cause strife and division. They can cause a lot of other people to suffer too. The contrast comes in verse 16. Yet if anyone suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God in this manner. If we're going to suffer for anything, we need to be suffering because we're taking a stand for the truth, because we're standing up for what's right. Sometimes we do suffer as a Christian. Sometimes we suffer because we get caught up in the moment. And we do things we shouldn't do. We say things we don't mean. We say things about other people that we shouldn't. Or we tear someone down. When if we really stop to think about it, we would say, I shouldn't have said that. And I know that there's plenty of times that I've fallen into that category. In our society today, so many things are driven by sarcasm and people trying to be funny and so on. And sometimes the easiest thing to do is to take a pot shot at somebody else. And just let our exhortation be from 1 Peter chapter 4 and 15. Let no one suffer as a busybody. But if anyone suffers as a Christian, that's what our goal should be. At this time, we always extend an invitation to anyone that may need to become a Christian, or anyone that may need to straighten some things out in their life. And if there's any way in which that we can be of service to you to help you do that, whether it's related to whispering, as we've discussed, or anything else, if there's any way that we can be of service, please let us know. All together we sing.